fractional micropayments, which some APIs may call for if an agent wants to use their service, I think would be better suited in stablecoins rather than a credit card.
One intuitively suitable use case for blockchains is to verify what action was conducted by a human versus what action was conducted by an agent or by a bot.
It's just so much more tedious than essentially wrapping that endpoint in this protocol called x402 and making so that once the agent just pings that page, it gets back requests saying, oh, you need to pay 3 cents to call this. And the agent just does it autonomously without having to check with its surveyor.
Welcome to episode 88 of the Odyssey Pod. Today we are joined by David, who is writing on everything crypto and AI related on the Bankless Mindshare newsletter. And I would argue that x402 has been a thing, agentic commerce has been a thing for the past couple of months at least. It has kind of been lurking in the CT trenches. I think around base, there has been a lot of conversation. Like some people are trying to find ways how to bet on it. Others are still stuck in the phase of just trying to understand the technology. We just had the Tempo mainnet launch a few days ago, and they introduced a competing standard to x402. So yeah, there's a lot going on in that field, and I think that David is one of the most competent people to speak on many of these questions. So thanks a lot for coming on, David. How are you doing?
I am good. Thanks so much for having me on, Max. I appreciate it.
Can you shed a bit of light on your background? How did you get into the industry? What did you do before? And yeah, how did you find your way to the Bankless Mindshare newsletter and into the whole crypto XAI niche?
How I got into crypto, I was doing research in college on just alternative ways to manage data on social media networks, which got me pretty excited about peer-to-peer technology. Blockchain, social tokens were really big back then. I went from there to work on a grant with the Ethereum Foundation on proof of personhood overall. Was working at a general non-existent crypto startup around that time, and proceeded to work on a Solana Foundation grant and an Urbit Foundation grant, and ended up at Bankless in around 2024, I think the beginning of 2024. And the reason I kind of started, well, I think Truth Terminal was really exciting for me. I just think it's hilarity, and it just felt like an actual person, like an actual crazy person tweeting in a really creative way. And for those who don't know, Truth Terminal was an experiment by some developer who got a grant from Mark Andreessen and Bitcoin in like fall 2024, where the developer essentially looped 2 different instances of Claude to talk with each other and create pretty, outrageous tweets. And then it kind of decided to co-opt this token that it found. That was just kind of the start of the craze, and that was pretty fun. And that whole agentic meta was pretty fun, even if it really blew up. And then it hardened into x402, and we started Mindshare, which is our newsletter about intersection of crypto and AI around that time. And it's just whether, there are or are not tokens or kind of trenches, quote unquote, around this technology currently. It's a pretty important intersection, as, all the headlines and Tempo launching MPP alongside the debut of their blockchain just demonstrates. And I've continued to cover it. I've continued to find it very interesting. I think something which may speak to others who've been in crypto for some time is that, at least on Twitter, it seems like the only 2 industries which ever had people be so excited about the technology that they were building with that they would make weekend projects and just kind of hack little things together were crypto and AI. And the intersection of both has just kind of been blossoming area in terms of new things to monitor and cover, even if many of them just fail and are just kind of flashes in the pan. It's just exciting. Yeah, I think that's what's kept me interested in x402 and just crypto AI overall. Also, it's obviously very Ethereum centric, which plays into Bankless's and our overall focus on, the world computer. So that's been a really cool intersection and just trend to continue exploring. And most recently, the launch of AD04, ERC AD04, which is an identity standard, has really kind of catalyzed a new wave of excitement around all this technology alongside a lot of developments in vibe coding. I think there's just so much that people can do and spin up and hack together in a weekend, which they just weren't able to do. And that's a pretty exciting state of affairs.
I think ever since late 2024, there has been a lot of attention on that niche in the industry, but I don't think that a lot of people have a clear conception of what are we actually able to do with it. So since you've been in these crypto XAI trenches ever since, can you walk us a bit through the evolution of the concepts that were discussed? I know that basically the takeaway from 2024 a few months later was that most of these tokens tied to AI agents were basically just wrappers of ChatGPT. So, from a layman's perspective, I would argue that most of what got launched throughout that period is not relevant anymore. At least it doesn't achieve any
Totally.
market share anymore. I think most of the price action is down only, or at least I haven't seen any of these tokens mentioned again on the timeline. So, what has changed since then, and how has this whole technology progressed, and why is it now actually fundamentally relevant to the space?
Well, x402, there's a couple points. It's a really good question. There's a couple differences over the span of the year. One, we had x402 launch, and we can get into what x402 actually solves and what the state of affairs of the internet overall is, which x402 calls for, or which call for x402. But I do think that, a lot of the tokens today are still wrappers in one way, shape, or form, right? At the end of the day, while we are seeing a lot of open source models getting better, and I know that NOS Research, which is a open source, uh, a pretty rigorous open source AI development lab, has recently launched Hermes, which is an open source agent. You know, I say it's still a wrapper, right? In a lot of ways, because all this is to a certain degree wrapping. I just think the base models have gotten much better, and it's become easier to use them, and like vibe coding has just become easier and better. Like, as someone who was building a bunch of apps last summer versus returning to it the past few months, I'm blown away by how much better it's gotten. It really, so sometimes it pays to go touch grass for 6 months or so, as they say. So I think there's more people can do with a lower technical um level of understanding, but like really the developments are that this stuff has matured, right? All those things were just kind of like, oh, let's see what we can do. There's a lot of capital flowing around. It was, post Trump, everyone was wanting to speculate. So there's a lot of capital in the market, and this trend was really picking up. And people were like, oh my God, like this thing tweets, which was, it is what it is. It was a fun time. And I know Eliza OS is still around from then. Tools is obviously still around from then. Those are two projects which, even if their tokens are nowhere near their peaks, matured into used infrastructure. And Virtual's actually co-authored one of the most recent EIPs, which we'll get to for this agentic economy. But going to like the kind of issues of the internet, which make ERC AD04 and x402 actually necessary, is that essentially the internet is being flooded by AI agents, and publishers are seeing their costs go up because of the amount of pings and requests that their websites are getting from these agents trying to scrape their data to train models. Like Wikipedia's traffic went up 50%. From 24 to 25. Many, a lot of like the directory of open access journals, things in that vein, these very like open access resource websites are going down, or seeing their websites just being brought to a halt by these just floods of requests, millions a month. And it's really just weighing on the entire internet. And obviously, the reaction for these businesses is to, or just sites overall, is to block bots. That's a lot easier said than done. One, it's really hard to distinguish between a bot and a human, especially, with like everyone having their own AI agent. I'm sure like I personally experienced a lot more CAPTCHA requests when I'm just like flipping around through tabs a bunch, which I'm just like, I'm not a bot. Anyways, essentially, so they're putting up stronger walls. They're trying to put up stronger walls, which is somewhat of a dead end because they're kind of closing their ecosystems or their platforms off to new discovery. And they're potentially shutting out a new customer, which is these agents. So they're also experimenting with this kind of model where it's let the agents pay, right? And the problem is agents can't open accounts or use credit cards. And also the costs potentially of accessing this data are so small that it's just weird for like a credit card or something to do. And using fractional micropayments via stablecoins, it's much easier. And also this whole point about agents not being able to open accounts or use credit cards, if you really want your agent to be autonomous and access these platforms, this dynamic data, let's say Bloomberg or, a place with high quality weather data, instead of making it so an agent would have to access the platform, set up an account on that new platform, even if it's going to be used once, you would have to then fill your account that you've set up on that platform with tokens, KYC, just do all that stuff. It's just so much more tedious than essentially wrapping that endpoint in this protocol called x402 and making so that once the agent just pings that page, it gets back requests saying, oh, you need to pay 3 cents to call this. And the agent just does it autonomously without having to check with its surveyor or, origin source, the person who owns it. So it's just a simpler, more tight flow. If that is clear, did you have any questions there?
Yeah, I think we'll get deeper into the whole distinguishing between bots, agents, and human users down the road of the conversation. Maybe can you identify and explain some of the key concepts that, like, of all these terms that are floating around x402, MPP, agentic commerce? What do people actually mean when talking about that? Like, what are the key technical concepts one needs to understand to actually read through the articles that you are writing and some other people who are active in researching agentic commerce topics?
Totally, yeah. So X402 is that concept that I just described. It is essentially a open protocol that revives this old HTTP 402 code, which was embedded into the internet in 1995. But with the thought that micropayments would take off, where I would pay $1 to access a website, an article on a website, or I would pay 30 cents to access, another article, right? But that hasn't taken off. The subscription model is just better because that micropayments introduces so much like mental friction, would just make it so that sites never really get traffic. Um, but agents don't go through that mental friction, right? And again, like a lot of these APIs or these data sets that these websites are opening up in theory are not compatible for agents to access, because if an agent wants to one-time query, again, like you're using an agent, for example, this is a great Galaxy research example, which I keep coming back to. You're using an agent to book a flight and or a vacation, excuse me, and you know where you want to go, but you kind of tack X402 onto this, give it a, spending limit of $3, and it goes and like does the research to find the best time to go to a certain place based on the weather. It queries that data, it takes it into account, and then it feeds it to the rest of the agent or a different agent, which will then go and find the cheapest flight, right? So it's kind of like X402 is very useful for letting agents access APIs without having to set up accounts, without having to KYC. It just abstracts that all away and just replaces it with stablecoins, which is smart in theory. And I keep saying in theory because I don't know, someone from Dragonfly just published a really good article, which I think resonates, but we can get to that later. MPP so X402 is Coinbase's open standard. MPP is Stripes or Tempos. And It's essentially just a smoother version of x402 in some ways, as you'd expect from, the leading payment provider type. It is built on 402 as well, so it's cross compatible with x402. So it's not people have to choose one or the other. It's like taking essentially x402 compatibility and then wrapping it in a version which is more suited to using existing payment rails like Stripes, right? So there's a lot more technical nuances, but I think without getting too deep into the weeds, that's the kind of side by side comparison I would make. So those are the two key parts. And they're just like essentially how would agents pay for a service, whether that service is data, whether that service is a skill, whether that service is, yeah, I think skills are a big one. But then there's ERC 8004, which is a reputation layer for agents. And that essentially is a standard deployed by the Ethereum Foundation themselves, the DAI team. And what that does is solves the trust problem for the, future world where agents interact and pay other agents for tasks or for services overall, right? Because if agents don't have trust, one, they could interact with an agent which prompt injects something back to them, and then, they, steal all your money from your wallet. Or also in the terms of like actually building a marketplace, if there's no trust, then agents are just competing on price alone. So they will just look for who can like provide the service at the lowest cost, which doesn't equate to quality at all. So to actually have trust being built, you need this reputation standard. And that's what ADO provides. Think of, the sequence, your agent or you discovers another agent via ERC ADO4. They negotiate through agent or some other standard, one of these open standards, and then they go through the process of creating, a task. There's a new standard from Virtuals and the Ethereum Foundation called ERC 8183, which is essentially sort of like an escrow contract for like, these are the terms of the deal, right? It's kind of the handshake agreement. And then, they do the job and then they settle the payment for that job via x402. And then that feedback is posted back to ED04 to develop that reputation.
What is the native match between crypto as infrastructure and blockchains and agents to run on them? Why can't they just use MasterCard, Visa, and like the existing payment rails? What do they need crypto for?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, as I said, the kind of autonomy really, instead of, having to go through KYC or stuff like that, blockchains just provide, the ability, like if you fill a wallet, right, with $50, you can let an agent run all night instead of like in the worst case scenario, you run out of credits or something and then you have to reload it with your MasterCard. I think also personally for me, something that I'm drawn to here, which others may not be, but I think there's a couple levels to this. But just back to that point, I would feel more comfortable connecting an agent to a wallet, which uses code which is just kind of this, segmented environment where it's not connected to my bank account. So if something doesn't go wrong, somehow it can draw from my bank account, right? It's about a kind of permissioned, siloed environment, which smart contracts and wallets provide. And then also back to the earlier point, the kind of fractional micropayments, which some APIs may call for if, an agent wants to use their service, I think would be better suited in stablecoins rather than a credit card. Also, there is the whole idea of like instantaneous settlement versus like the 1 to 3 waiting period for credit cards. That being said, I do still think there is obviously a use case for credit cards. I'm not too well versed in that debate and haven't been tracking it as much because I just kind of believe it'll be rightfully or wrongly both at the end. But I do think these kind of hobbyist or more kind of autonomous, like if you really want an agent to run autonomously and you want to give it control to do that, using stablecoins, which one exists in a siloed environment, and two settle instantaneously, and then three also can be split or are more able to be fractionalized and split to service micro payments, I think it's just a better set of toolkits to provide your agents with. That being said, on the sort of enterprise level, right, where you have an agent inside a venture fund, and that venture fund has a subscription with, let's say, Bloomberg, and it's a subscription where it pays by calls of their data rather than, just a general overall subscription. I feel like at the end of the day there, it's probably going to use a card because you can just settle up monthly for all the costs. But really for these like one-off, smaller kind of bottom-up projects, if that makes sense, that will use stablecoins. So it's to really, just as, with crypto, giving people the ability to kind of exist outside of institutions, stablecoins, ETH 8004, x402 enable agents to exist outside of traditional payment rails and traditional service systems.
So you already hinted on consuming content in like micropayments towards publications or articles and media as a use case. You recently published an article called Your X402 Wishlist. Maybe can you walk us through some of these examples? Why we haven't been able to build them yet, and also what would they be useful for on the bottom line for both like the infrastructure, but also for the end user level?
Yeah, I think the thing with x402, which we're seeing, I'm forgetting his name, but I think his handle is on-chain Lou over at Artemis, has been superbly tracking, is that a ton of x402 volume is incredibly gamed. And if you kind of look at the trend line, volume has just continued to trend downwards in terms of overall dollar-based volume being exchanged for these services. And I think it's just a matter of, well, two things. One, which I'll get to after this, but first, there's no real services that people want to pay for, which I think is totally understandable. This is the early stages. We're still fleshing out the infrastructure. X402 is nowhere near perfect. MPP is much smoother as a protocol. And I shared some examples here because I think these are very personal, and more just tailored to like what I would want to see. I think the one that stands out the most for me, I think, is the paid paper call skills. I think if you're looking anywhere, you see the term skills come up, which are essentially just like specialized. They're documents. They're simple documents, text documents, which clearly explain to an agent how to do something, right? And there have been studies, there was a study put out last month, which showed that smaller models, when equipped with skills, can outperform larger, more frontier models in specific domains or specific tasks with skills, right? And these skills are humans who've accrued knowledge by doing something or, working in certain fields for a long amount of time, applying that learned experience to making a skill file, right? And agents are not good at making skill files. The study also showed that, like, it put Opus 4.5 alongside Haiku, which is Claude's like tiny model, which is just super fast but super light. And Claude Haiku with a skill attached outperformed Opus 4.5 without a skill, which is pretty incredible. And I think it's really useful when you consider the fact that agents are trending more locally, and edge inference, which is literally just like models existing on devices, is becoming more and more popular. That being said, like, your phone only has so much RAM or so much storage, blah, blah. So you kind of need a smaller model. And if you equip it with a skill, you can get like frontier model performance, right? Which is incredible. And I think it's pretty ridiculous that people are just kind of giving away skills. It's awesome. But these are people, like Gary Tan or like Anthropic is making these skills, which, if you were to pay a consultant to essentially complete the same task, that would probably, be tens of thousands of dollars a month. But you could essentially train an agent to do that by packaging that in a skill. And if there's, so I just think people if you have a real skill and you're giving it away, which is a very virtuous thing to do, I think there's just a mispricing of that currently because that is just earned experience. And the study that I'm referencing also showed that agents who use AI based skills did not come anywhere close to the performance enhancements that they did if the skills were actually made by humans with that domain specific knowledge. Right. So there is this element of learned experience and learned expertise that must be there. And agents can't replicate that. And I think, that could be a service which instead of giving that skill away for like a flat price, it's a really high quality skill. You could just make it an endpoint for an agent to call and pay like $5 or something for, or $10, and that's the one I want to call out most specifically. I can go into the other ones; they're a little more niche, but I think that touches on a couple different things. So let me know if you have any questions, or I'd love to hear your reactions to that.
Yeah, am I assuming correctly that the edge that humans have when designing a skill is not necessarily that they have more like technical knowledge than an AI of how to like phrase it that the AI agent understands it, but it's really just acquired expertise in that specific domain. So the human still outperforms in giving context to the agent, right?
100%. Yeah, I think context is a great word there.
Yeah. What about some other use cases?
Yeah, I like the niche crypto news aggregation bundle. I think that's a useful one. Someone served up a Solana news x402 feed, which they could query, just given how fragmented information is, especially in our industry, across Telegram, across Twitter, across Discord. That could just be a very nice service, which I think I would pay, like 15 cents or 50 cents to call if I got like high quality Ethereum news every Friday in my inbox. Yeah, I can talk about other ones, but I think there was one about the newsletter and podcast performance, which I think is a fun idea. Essentially, this would probably be really tricky, but if someone made an endpoint, which essentially you can like run a specific podcast through and kind of track their calls, if they said buy stock at X price on Y date, and then they said sell 6 months later, like what was the return? What was the performance of their calls? That'd be really cool. Security and audit tracker. I think there's mixed reports on this, but EVM Bench, which was a paper put together by Paradigm and OpenAI, that found that agents are really good at security auditing. I would still not 100% trust an agent to do that, but I think they can kind of get over the initial tasks, right? We're seeing some of those builds. I actually linked in there. I think maybe I didn't, but there was that same week, there was a reputable security auditing firm who audited like Pump Fund, Uniswap, Athena, a bunch of places. They released a Solidity security agent and just open source. I don't know how it's performed, haven't been tracking that, but I do feel like a lot of this stuff can be automated in security. I kind of resonate with Peter Thiel's saying of, like the people kind of who are exposed to AI, I think we're all exposed to AI, but like maybe particularly exposed to AI are like code people, just because as Hasib Queershy from Dragonfly also pointed out on one of our when he came on our podcast, that this kind of data rich or code rich environment is just native for agents and not for humans. Kind of that's the framing he uses to explain why crypto may be better built for agents than for people. Yeah, so I think that all feeds into like agents are good at dissecting code. They're obviously not the best. If you've ever vibe coded anything, you'll know like they kind of they just make a lot of mistakes, and we're nowhere near like, or I don't know, maybe we are, but in terms of as layman's use of these models, we're not close to being able to letting the agents just hang out. run completely on their own, in my opinion.
Yeah, I listened to that episode with Hazeeb as well. I can highly recommend it to everybody because I think for people who are very DeFi native but not necessarily techies or engineers, that was a very good explanation from like a low to a high level why blockchain and crypto as infrastructure is more suitable for agents overall than it is for humans. And I would say I more or less subscribe to the thesis that very soon we'll see much more transaction on blockchains, yeah, being executed by agents than by humans. I think Brian Armstrong from Coinbase also shared that take a while ago. Speaking of all of these different standards, all of these different chains, so we have x402 on Base, we have the Ethereum Foundation publishing, yeah, these reputation standards or like the agent reputation score. We have Tempo, which I think is also EVM based, introducing MPP together with Stripe and positioning itself as the chain designed for payments. You also mentioned previously that overall the whole agentic commerce stack is rather EVM centric. So how can we envision agents interacting on blockchains alongside humans and like regular users? Are they just a part of the blockchain economy on every single chain? Will there be kind of a separate standard, a separate environment that they will act in versus where all the human users will interact in? Or how can we roughly envision it? Because I think for non technical people, it seems like there are dozens, if not hundreds, of companies trying to target a very niche part of that vertical payment stack when it comes to stablecoin API, interoperability between chains. Like there's a huge mass of these infrastructure, and like from a non-technical perspective they all seem like the bottom layer of the tech stack, firms and projects, yet nobody is able to really put that puzzle together and say, okay, will there be one vertical stack to rule them all, or will they all play a very small but very important role in that sector?
I think they'll exist code like just they already exist on chain with us. I'd like to say it's Ethereum. I think the Ethereum Foundation is working really hard to make sure it is Ethereum. I think Ethereum makes the most sense when you zoom out. I think Solana is also seeing a lot of agentic activity. I think Solana also makes a lot of sense. I think that just comes down to like which chains are being the most used and which have can which speed, like which chains can facilitate this speed and the level of and transactions that agents need and will act in. I think that's Solana. I think that's Base. I think that's Tempo. I think it's really just the use case. I don't know how. I think Solana has an advantage in some sense because the chain is parallelized. Transactions, if they're not affecting the same thing, can just run parallel. So potentially there's more throughput, which is good for agents. Particularly, I think they'll be everywhere, and I know there's some great companies building out specific use cases, and really around yield, I think is a big one, because no one really wants to, and also with just like the competitive nature of DeFi maturing, and also people just having to, I don't know. I think DeFi yield is something which requires constant attention, and no one has the ability to give something constant attention except an agent. So that's why we have things like Giza, which runs algorithms and uses agents and machine learning and all this stuff to optimize its yields, shift capital from one to the next, to really squeeze out that juice for its end user. Zi-Fi also does this. Those are both Ethereum centric. I don't know if they're expanding to Solana, but I think yield's a really big one. I think trading isn't, maybe delta neutral, but that's just yield in one way, shape, or form. I don't think we'll see agents really outperform traders if they're just running autonomously, or at least for some time. We've run countless of these trading arena experiments, which I think is cool in the sense that the market is a much more dynamic environment to benchmark agents' abilities against, because there's just so many inputs. And it's just a better test in a lot of ways, right? Like if you're measuring someone's ability to take in data, maybe not their social skills, but to take in data and forecast outcomes, you would go to markets, I'd say. I think that's a pretty good place to test that. We haven't seen any agents really do that well so far. I know Wi-Fi ran one recently. I don't know. There's been countless, to be honest. Aster Dex ran one. I think agents outperformed humans, but like they were both negative. Wasn't that none of these experiments in terms of my eyes? And please, someone who's listening, if you think there is one which really stands out, none have particularly excited me. Uh,
Friend
it's
of
just kind of
mine, Danny, he might be listening to that pod, and he has been trying to delegate his trading activities over to his agents. And a few days ago, he told me that his agent actually started lying about his P&L and his performance.
yeah, yeah. So I think it's hard. And I get the idea of, like an expert trader, right? Kind of speeding up his workflow with agents. And I think that makes perfect sense. I don't think that's what we're talking about here. Yeah, but I don't know. I think that's kind of all I honestly have to think about agentic commerce. The FOMO trader or the FOMO founder. FOMO is this consumer app for like meme coins, which is really great. Shout out FOMO. He's just like agentic commerce makes sense to me. Agentic trading doesn't, and I really resonate with that. Yeah, it's the whole thing about skills, right?
Yeah. I mean, of course, on the very high end of high frequency trading, I mean, they've been using machine learning and large language models and like trying to like self iterate on their principles and statistics and methodologies for decades now. There, the agents might play a role, but I mean, they still haven't replaced all the quant engineers that like Optiver, Jane Street, Citadel, etc., are hiring with hundreds of thousands of dollars in salary right out of college. So I do agree that agents as of now are much more relevant and interesting for any type of monitoring tasks where humans simply cannot compete with the frequency that is needed to monitor something or with the endurance and the liveness that something needs to be monitored with. Where I do think we could meet in the middle between like trading or generating yield and just monitoring stuff. I think anything that in the direction of vaults that are allocating into different like lending opportunities or like vaults that are allocating into other vaults. Of course, you still have a lot of tail risks that have to be solved, but the agents are like not, overstepping certain permissions. But I think in terms of constantly calculating risk reward scores and like assessing which of these allocations makes the most sense right now, I think there is a potential use case that I would see. Also, we just saw Resolve and their stablecoin DPEG and after an exploit yesterday. So maybe, I'm not sure to what extent that would work already, if like a vault was monitored by an agent, it would have been able to like identify that DPEG earlier than most human users, especially if you're lending towards somebody who has supplied the Resolve stablecoin as a collateral, then you would have been one of the people who would have withdrawn from that vault the earliest. So you might have been able to avoid that debt in that case.
Yeah, I think that's that's the resolve instance was exactly what I was thinking about as you're saying this. I haven't been tracking the evolution of vaults as I just haven't been really tracking it. I know it's a big thing. I can't imagine that they're not using AI for that already. Like they have hundreds of millions of dollars at stake here. They're definitely employing every single skill. I think there are some tools that they can use in terms of, I know EigenLayer or EigenDA, EigenCloud, whatever they're called now. They are building something called verifiable inference, which essentially like lets you remove all the randomness from prompts and inference. So, when you type hello into Claude, you'll get a different response probably every single time, or at least variation responses. But if you run it through an AI, which is in this verifiable LLM like stack, then you'll get the same response over and over again, which is good to kind of like firm up these defenses. I think potentially in those cases, I I can't really speak too much about vaults. I don't think it's the last exploit we'll see. Uh, I'm kind of amazed that I don't know, I haven't been tracking Giza again, which is really, in my eyes, the number one yield agent, or Zi-Fi. I don't think they were exposed, which is pretty cool. Vaults feel like something that definitely need to get fleshed out and need more risk monitoring. But I know those institutions, those companies which are stewarding the vaults are definitely employing AI, right, behind the scenes. But I don't know how quick prevention can be there. I think it's tricky.
What would you say does Giza improve and innovate on what has previously been available? I know that Almanac has been, I don't want to say a predecessor, but they've tried to use agents a lot when it comes to the strategy formation and like the research, but less so the execution. So, what is Giza building that Almanac has not been able to achieve? And
I
how have
think
you?
they're definitely different things. To be honest, I am not versed in the technicals of Giza. I think I really only understood them through the lens, which was like agents and using AI will kind of like to Hasib's point, will just become a easier interface for acting on chain through, rather than, flipping around all these different vaults, right? If you just have an agent doing that and optimizing for yield on the back end, that's a lot smoother. I don't know what they're specifically doing to outperform. I don't know where Almanac went wrong. I think Almanac, from my understanding, I think can fit into this agentic trading overhype thread that we're discussing. Um, with like, I don't know, like they just it's hard to automate trading, right? And it's hard to, like, if it was that easy, we would see Jane Street's revenue like quadruple every month, but we haven't, at least to my knowledge. So, the market just keeps getting more competitive. And I think it's really hard for smaller startups to compete.
Yeah, a few days ago, I saw Catalyst, which seems to be trying to target that same vertical, but with like a larger extent on the stack. So there it is not only about crafting the strategy, but basically also stepping forward into the execution. So what would you say makes you inherently critical of approaches like that? And what would need to happen to how we can verify agents, but also how we are able to instruct agents for outsourcing trading to agents becoming a more realistic and like a more prudent thing to do from an allocator's perspective?
Yeah, I think some things we can do are probably one, I think agents just need to mature. I think also two, I think employing things like verifiable inference from companies like Eigenlayer could definitely go the distance here towards, eliminating problems like your friend ran into where his agent was just lying about the P&L that he was generating. I haven't been following that. This is something I want to dive deeper in too. So if anyone feels they're an expert, please feel free to DM me. The new auto research thing that Andre Karpathy put out, which is just kind of like, from my understanding, like looping training with also some memory components. I haven't had much time to dive deep into it yet. I think this is kind of, I think it's just like the next thing that people want to try. And I think it's also like the $1 million, like it's the $1 trillion, to be honest, like idea. If you can make it so that anyone can make money easily, like, people are going to keep taking shots on goal for that, right? That's kind of how I see it more than anything else. I feel like if Jane Street releases a model, right? Like that's also like they have no incentive to release a model, right? Like why would anyone share this? I do think maybe, frameworks for professional traders to automate their own strategies are useful, but I'm sure those things already existed. And I feel like AI just in a lot of ways potentially adds just an uncontrollable variable to this equation, which doesn't need to be added in most cases. Oh, yeah, that's my kind of stance on it.
We touched upon verifiability and kind of maintaining and keeping track of the integrity of an agent quite a few times. I think one intuitively suitable use case for blockchains that many people who have been in the space for years, but I would also say outsiders who have just heard of like the basic principles of blockchain and Bitcoin before, is to verify what action was conducted by a human versus what action was conducted by an agent or by a bot. Because if we think the whole agentic commerce and the agentic economy a few steps forward, if everybody is employing, not in the literal sense, but using agents to conduct like a lot of transactions that would happen in one's life, either for like research purposes, to consume media, to consume information, to like, send your agent shopping, to like do your grocery list and then executing the payments. There will be a point, especially when it comes to the integrity of media, who has been saying what, and to hold people accountable. I would argue it will be absolutely essential to have almost 100% certainty over what has been said and what has been executed by a human versus by an agent. So, would you say that this is something that is in development? And if so, are there any projects that, are taking the lead here? I would say the most normie friendly example for that would probably be WorldCoin. So, like, if you have an opinion on that, I'd be curious to hear it. But yeah, how do you think about that whole integrity question and like keeping track of what was executed and what was done by what type of actor?
Yeah, I think blockchains are perfect for that, right? They're auditable and they can serve as a great tool here. I do think things like verifiable inference, if we're talking about AIs acting in a certain way and having that be reproducible, Eigenlayer definitely making strides there. I think WorldCoin is interesting, or World. I know they released last week a way to have agents prove that they're coming from a real person, which I think will matter in a lot of instances, particularly when it comes to potentially accessing websites through an agent, proving that it's coming from a person, I think will be useful. I know Reddit is considering and has been considering implementing Face ID. They specifically mentioned World as one of the things they were considering. So I think there are definitely a lot of ways that blockchains can play a role as a registry of truth. And I think they kind of already play that, or aspire to play that. So I'm excited to see it flesh out, but it really feels like the most immediate ones that come to mind are World, Eigenlayer, and then just blockchains overall. I'd say Ethereum.
Yeah. Since we're getting closer to the hour, are there any topics you'd like to cover that we have not touched upon yet? Or any hot takes you would like to share surrounding the current state of the markets, or specifically the agentic commerce niche?
Yeah, I think one thing that I wrote about recently last Friday, which I think is a really interesting point that people are missing in the whole x402 versus MPP debate, which I can summarize quickly, is that Cloudflare is the central actor in all this, right? They're building the walls to help these websites. They already service 20% of the internet, which is a huge amount. They've been building ways to help websites block bots for a few years now. But last summer, pre the release of their foundation, the X402 Foundation with Coinbase, they released pay per crawl, which is a tool where essentially bots can crawl or scrape a website and that website can charge them the fee, right? It's this permissioned access that I was talking about in the beginning.
So you would say that
And
Cloudflare is kind of the ultimate gatekeeper of the internet.
I don't know if they're the ultimate gatekeeper. I'm not too well versed. There's a bit of an echo all of a sudden. Okay, thanks. It's not the ultimate gatekeeper, but they're like, I think they're the gatekeeper that people know the most. And I think they're definitely central to this. And they're the only people who are making strides on X4. They're the only gatekeeper who's really making strides on X402 or being so involved in that. Because then in September, they released this X402 Foundation with Coinbase, right? Coinbase had debuted, and it was pretty amazing that Cloudflare was working so hard. It makes sense though, given how much of a kind of linchpin they are in this dynamic. Following the release of the X402 Foundation, Cloudflare announced the Net Dollar, which we don't really know much about it, but it's a 1-to-1 USD backed stablecoin for doing these actions related to X402 and web scraping and for bots. It's just for agentic payments. It's how they describe it. And they didn't announce an issuer, which was surprising. And then a series of months later, December, Coinbase has their system reboot announcement or system update, whatever it's called. And one of the features they announced is that they will be providing stablecoins as a service through their Coinbase business to let anyone essentially deploy their own stablecoin through Coinbase. And they would do that through their partnership with Circle. So it's very, you know, one service wrapped in another service wrapped in another service. But even then, Cloudflare didn't announce that they were releasing the net dollar with Coinbase. And an article came out last week in the information, which talks about Coinbase going into agentic payments and stuff like that, blah, blah, and them being one of the people vying for the deal of releasing Cloudflare's net dollar, which isn't a really good sign, in my opinion, for x402. And the pay per crawl feature, which Cloudflare announced and is in beta right now, in private beta, I think, actually uses Stripe. You pay for it through Stripe, right? And Stripe is also just like the dominant payments player already, right? And and also Cloudflare now supports MPP, which obviously they would. It's also an open standard, not too big of a deal. But I think all these pieces together are like making it so there is a good chance that Cloudflare chooses open issuance, which is bridges, which is tempos, which is Stripe's stablecoin as a service platform, to issue net dollar through. Obviously, then they have an incentive to, and net dollar can be issued through X4 or used through x402 or MPP. It doesn't matter, but just all these ecosystem synergies are kind of lining up so that if Cloudflare chooses to launch net dollar with open issuance, that would definitely be a blow towards x402 and also a pretty big slight, to be honest, considering they launched the x402 foundation with Coinbase, because they would obviously have a desire to incentivize using net dollar. I'm not sure how fee structures work with open issuance, but I'm sure they take a cut of all stable coins that are issued through their platform, which means that just like activity would, like, incentives would line up for using MPP, for using Stripe, for integrating with all of Stripe's stack. I don't think it's the worst. Like, I don't think it's a bad thing. I just think it's a piece of the puzzle that people are missing when it comes to x402 versus MPP. Because yeah, sure, like Stripe's MPP has like some smoother technicals, blah blah blah. I don't, and the advantage of using Stripe's existing payments is a big plus. But I think Cloudflare could really move the needle here. I think that's something people are missing and something to watch out for.
So this creates the impression that with agents that are supposed to abstract away interacting through all of these different layers, we are ending up with a state where it is just more and more layers introduced on top, more and more friction introduced on top. So this whole, like, if you look at a fraction from like high school math where you had that rule, but you can just like, reduce things away over each other, it feels like this is an artificially complex infrastructure because certain players are gatekeepers over certain niches of the whole value stack, so they can accrue value. They obviously don't want to give it up. They don't want to all make it open source or all permissionless. And now you have these agents that have to kind of run through all of these different steps and like abstract them away for the user not to feel something. So, I mean, this could easily spiral into a more philosophical conversation about how value overall would accrue in the agentic economy. But it seems like, from a layman's perspective, my perspective, that there is an incentive to artificially inflate the different steps of value creation, and like everybody is trying to take his or her little share out of this value stack rather than just building one standard that kind of covers everything from beginning to end and let agents interact on that. But we
Well,
obviously
I
don't
think
have to we don't have to open a whole new debate on that.
no, totally. I think that's that's a whole different conversation as you shared. But I do think at the end of the day, right, like there is, with agents becoming a predominant part of the internet if they haven't been already, or agents which can act more dynamically and act in a way with which has more impact. Like the internet is kind of getting repiped, right? Like, it's kind of like a sewer system for a city. They have this big project which which people are taking out bids on, and they're kind of building, out the new sewage system for the city, right? Which is the internet in this case. And I think a lot of people are going to want to throw their hats in the ring there. It makes perfect sense. So hopefully, and I think, I know both x402, Coinbase via x402, and Stripe via MPP they're smart companies. And I think x402 seems pretty easy to implement. I haven't done it myself personally. But one line of code, I think MPP similarly, or a few lines of code, it's not the biggest change. And I think stable coins can really just make things run smoother. I think it's just kind of an updating of the sewer system, to go back to that example or that metaphor. We'll see what happens. But yeah, I think there's just like, we're essentially kind of repiping the internet right now. And we'll see if these standards are what is used. And there definitely are a lot of existing actors which are kind of merging or interacting with crypto native players in a way that I don't think we've seen in a long time, which is kind of similar to what's going on in TradFi and crypto overall, but I think it's cooler on this side.
Just to finish this conversation off, where do you think we will stand at the end of the year when it comes to all things agentic payments and agentic commerce? Maybe to make it a little more tangible for the listeners, specifically, what use cases will likely be executed or can be executed by agents at the end of the year?
Well, I hope more than now. But I think that just really depends on like building specialized services that people want to pay for through x402 or MPP. Yeah, I think that that's kind of there's a lot of levels to that question. That's a good question. I think on the consumer side, I really just hope, to go back to the x402 wish list, people build services like that where agents or even non-agents, just kind of like apps could call x402 and pay for that. Apps with their own wallet. It doesn't just have to be agents. It'd be cool. It's kind of like a hope that I hope more than where we're at. I don't really know where we'll be at by the end of the year. I, I think there will be evolution in all of this. I think I think MPP and Tempo will definitely have breaking a lot of ground. I'll be interested to see I know they have Anthropic, OpenAI, all these people already signed up. It'll be interesting to see those companies potentially go live with, here you can use your bot. Using Stripe, you can query X or Y API or use our service in X or Y way. I think a lot of the development is going to come from Stripe and Tempo, to be honest. I think x402 will be chugging along, and then there's some pretty really cool services coming out of x402. But I feel like in terms of like what will be making the headlines, I think it'll be Stripes. Yeah.
It will be very interesting to see for what is to come. I certainly think that it is still a very messy sector of the industry, and a lot of the relevant questions have not been answered. I mean, there are the answer options in the room, but I don't think that most of the winners have been picked or even shown themselves yet. It was really interesting having you on. Would
Thanks
love
so
to
much for having me on.
have a panel debate on this and like the implications of the agentic economy in the future again with a few other people as well. So you're more than welcome to return on the pod. Where can people find you? How can people get in contact if they want to talk agentic commerce, x402, MPP, and all of the other topics that we just talked about?
I say my Twitter, Dave Ward online, DAVEWARD online. Yeah, you can find me in Bankless. Subscribe to Mindshare. I can include the link for the podcast or for the newsletter below. The live stream link here. But yeah, I write about this stuff weekly in Mindshare, and I'm getting more active on Twitter. So I think those are the best places to chat.
Great. I'll make sure to put all the links in the podcast description. Thanks a ton for coming on, David. That definitely helped me learn a lot more about X402 and the state of crypto XAI. And yeah, hopefully chat soon again.
Certainly.